Hello, and welcome to Identity Management with Library Juice Academy. I'm your instructor, Robin Fay, and I wanted to go over a quick class outline and then we'll dive right in. So this week, we're really going to be looking at sort of the history of identity management, how identity management as a concept is growing. We're going to also talk about what we've done in terms of identity management and how that differs between libraries, archives, museums, and the web. So we're going to kind of look at it through that lens. Next week, we're really going to dive into what should be an interesting and engaging topic, certainly a hot topic. We're going to be talking all about the challenges and ethics of um, managing identity. So how privacy plays into it, how the evolving data that we all are creating, how people change over time and how that impacts their data. We're going to talk all about all of those interesting topics next week because it is such a critical piece of this. And then in week 3, we're really going to spend a significant amount of time really comparing the data and practices across digital library, institutional repository kind of software, and then also looking a little bit at the web and then library cataloging. So we're really going to look a lot at records. We're going to talk about how that information is reflected in the records and how practices differ in those communities. We'll talk a little bit about how practices differ this week, but we're really going to be looking at the data and really examining those resources and talking about it. Then finally, for next week, we are going to, or for the final week, we are going to really spend time looking at the resources themselves. So looking at what resources you can use in terms of verifying identities or establishing identities, how you may be able to participate in some of these communities. We'll talk about projects that are out there that libraries and archives are working on in terms of collaborating with others across the web in terms of identity management. And you'll finish up or wrap up with a case study paper. So it's not going to be a really long paper, but I really want you to think very critically through some of the things we'll be talking about for the previous 3 weeks. And then finally, I want you really to be able to get a sense of if you are working on an institutional repository project, or maybe you are going to be working on your website, or maybe you're doing a website redesign and you want to talk about how identities are represented on your website, or maybe you're doing some cataloging and you want to um, explore identities a little bit differently than what we've done. So how would you go about doing that? So we're gonna look at a case study. We're going to talk about it, and I really want you to kind of put on your thinking caps in terms of like what would it mean to kind of think beyond what we currently do. So let's just dive in. Each week there will be the class session, and the class session I will upload the slides first, and then I'll do the class session, and we'll have weekly discussion. Please participate in the weekly discussion. It's very important. It is part of your grade and your assignment and all that other kind of stuff, but you will get so much more out of class if you participate. And, that's true in terms of I'll be in the forum some and answering questions and participating. I'll share additional resources. I have some fun resources to share. So I'll be sharing those in the forums too as we talk about particular topics. But do participate in the weekly discussions because that's part of what makes these classes so special and engaging, I think. And also, it's a great opportunity to talk with some of your colleagues that you might not get to see for a while or you might not have met before. So I think that's one of the other things, especially in this time where we're not getting to go to a lot of conferences and engage with people. Uh, you know, it's an opportunity to kind of network and talk to people as well. So what is identity management? What does it really mean? Well, identity management, really from a traditional IT viewpoint, is really all about authenticating user and user roles. So if you've worked on a website, or maybe you did a WordPress, or you did a blog, or maybe you participate in a bulletin board or any of those kinds of things where users have roles, or maybe you are an administrator or set up users in your ILS, your library catalog. If you've done any of that kind of work, then you've dealt with this very much so, where it's like, okay, I need to set up a user. What role are they going to be? What permissions are they going to have? And that's really been what we think of very traditionally with identity management. It has been viewed almost solely through the lens of those user roles and their access to some particular software or system. So, it's really about how do these tools know who the users are? So how do these softwares know who the users are? And then how the users can interact with the system. So what permissions do we give them? What roles do we give them? And this really is focused on user accounts and then those roles and permissions. Now, these may be roles and permissions that are assigned and granted. We assign people certain roles, we let them do certain things, or it may be we say, no, you can't do anything. Like, it's the opposite. It's more of a deny first and allow later sort of approach. So like this little diagram, it kind of goes through like a little bit of workflow in terms of, you are setting up something new, you have a user who registers, there is some looking at the credentials. So what credentials did that user present? Well, if you signed up for Facebook, what did you present as credentials? You presented a name and you filled out some information about yourself. If you signed up in the very early days of Facebook, you had to have an EDU email address. And if you didn't have that, then you were not allowed to continue through the process. So you're just denied. If you had an EDU account, that was really the only credential you had to have for Facebook for at least a little while. Then slowly along the way, they started adding more questions like, what is your birth date? Because they wanted to make sure to get people who are over the age of 13 typically for using the internet, and all those various things. They now ask you a gazillion questions. But initially, it was all about, did you have an EDU account? So that's the other part with this credential process, is it may change as software evolves, or it may change because of needs of a specific type of software too. So if you provide the credentials needed, such as an EDU account back in the olden days of Facebook, then it would say, yes, you're authorized and we're going to create that account. So it sets up that account, you're ready to go, you're ready to do whatever you're doing. Same thing in your ILS. You are probably, your account's probably created by someone, and maybe it's loaded against, say, your loaded against maybe your library or university directory or something like that, and all the accounts are loaded in, but there's some kind of way that those accounts are created. Once that account's created, though, then it becomes more of an operational thing. So you go to Facebook or your ILS and you type in. So you type in your name and you type in your password. So that password is your credential, or if you have single sign-on, it's actually accessing some other information to authenticate you to say, yes, you are who you say you are. And then again, it allows you to access those materials. So that's sort of the basics. It gets way more complicated than that, but that's really the basics of kind of like how we viewed identity management. It is about the management of users and what roles that they have. And when we kind of think about identity management through that landscape, what happens in the course of creating those records? What happens through the course of creating those accounts? Well, we create an account, and here's an example from an ILS. Lots of different ILSs look different, but we, create an account. In this case, our user account is Sitka CertCat. So there's our username. That's kind of who we are in this particular ILS. There's some other information there to kind of say a little bit more about us. And then here we have all these permissions, and if they're applied, they're allowed, and if they're not applied, then we don't get those permissions. But in the course of creating that, we are providing some information. In this case, just for this very simple example of the ILS, we have first name, a middle name, and a last name. Of course, when you have a user account that's kind of like the shared thing, first name, middle name, last name doesn't work very well. But It suffices for what we need to do. So let's identify identity management and then see how it fits in with our work. See how it fits in with this sort of concept of identity that's more expansive than that. So I think Wikipedia has a really good definition of this because they address all aspects of identity management. And I really want you to pay attention to this aspect of identify because that's really going to get to the heart of what we are starting to do with identity management. So it's about identifying and access of management system. So some kind of system is involved in this. And then control and access for individuals. So there we get to that authentication aspect. And they do mention utilizing IT resources because it is typically about uh, those credentials to be able to log into something. Now you may think like, well, gosh, it's not like always IT. It could be like the ILS, or it could be my blog, or it could be like the healthcare system. Those are all IT systems. Now, granted, they do different things. That's library IT, or that's healthcare IT, or blogger IT is your social media IT, but there is still technology behind it. So it's about that. And then it's also about the hardware and all the applications and other things that we may do that aren't cloud-based that are also have this authentication aspect. But, to a lesser extent, it's been about users controlling their information. So it's more about like how these systems are managing user accounts and how they're managing permissions and all that kind of stuff. And it's really been focused on that like access and control of that person. What can that person do while they're in that particular system? And that's certainly a very important part of it, right? Especially as we talk about like privacy and security of our data and, someone stealing our password or identity theft, all those kind of things that we hear about that have to do with access of systems or using our credentials or any of that kind of stuff. Certainly that's a very, very important piece of identity management, but that's really how IT has traditionally thought about identity management. It's been at the system side, like how is the system doing this? To a lesser extent, I think is the other piece of it, like how do we control our information? Like how do we as users control our information? And this has been baked into technology for a while where we see terms of service, right? You're like, I agree to this thing that I probably didn't read. Well, that's sort of the IT way of like telling us like how we can use it and what's going to happen to us if we misuse their software, or how they will protect our privacy or not, all of that kind of stuff. But it's really only been in the last few years that we're really starting to see people become very aware of, not only the terms of service that they're signing when they sign up for things, but also, you know, what are the user rights? Like, what do we get out of doing this? I mean, yeah, we get free Facebook, we get free Twitter, we get access to an ILS, we get access to our medical information online, we get to do a blog or social media or whatever it may be. We get to post TikToks, all of those kind of things. So we get that out of it. We get to use that software and we get to be part of the community. But then what's the other piece of it that happens? Like what happens to all that data that we create? And so this is a piece of it that really just in the last few years, we're starting to really see people talk about, like, what happens to that user's information and how can I know more about what's going to happen to my data? And, it should be more transparent in terms of what they're doing with my data. So we are starting to have those conversations about that really kind of sticky part of data. So that's definitely one part of identity management too, is like how we manage our own individual identities in this space. And one of the things I would want you to take away from this class is that identity management is kind of all of these things. So it's the systems, it's the product, it's the platforms that manage identifying. So manage identifying who we are. It manages then all that data that's created about us. And I think this piece of Wikipedia really gets to what we're looking at it from a metadata standpoint, is it's managing the identification and the data that's created about entities, and that includes individuals. So it's really talking, what we're looking at is this piece of it from that Wikipedia describes as manage identifying and data about identities that includes individuals. And so that's really one of the critical pieces of it in terms of how we fit into it. The other piece of it that is how we fit into it is how users gain an identity. So like, what is that process for how that identity is created? And we're going to talk a lot more about that piece of it as we go along. So as you're sort of exploring identity management and we're talking about these topics, we'll be looking at it through a very narrow lens of metadata and how that fits in with what libraries, people on the web, archives, metadata workers, all of us, how we really view that information, but it's just one little tiny piece of this really big, large, complex topic that's identity management. So, as I mentioned, it has traditionally been focused on roles, user accounts, and access, less on the identity itself. And this is the piece of it we're really starting to talk about, not only in terms of privacy in the terms of service being more transparent for people to be able to opt in or out of things. Am I going to be tracked on the web? I should be able to opt out of that. We're, starting to see California's passed some laws in terms of like more strengthening privacy in terms of technology. Certainly Europe is really tackling this issue and forcing software developers and companies to really look at how they handle user data. And so all of this is really going to start driving this conversation forward, which I think is going to be great for everyone because it's one of these things we should have been talking about for a while. And I think part of this, I've been thinking a lot about like why hasn't like privacy and user data been more important from the beginning? Like why didn't the web really seem sometimes to even seem to care about it? It's more about developing the product and being able to sell all these wonderful things and to communicate things to people, to connect people together. I mean, there's so many wonderful things on the web and some very negative things on the web too. But there's a lot of wonderful things that happen on the web. And it seems like that protection of user data or even educating people in terms of what their user data looks like or what happens with your user data seems like that's been very low on the priority list. It's more about what's the new thing, what's the new social media, what's going to come after TikTok. That's that seems to be more of what we've been focused on. And I think part of that is because in the early days of the web and in software, there was quite a bit of sort of anonymous activity. There wasn't as much tracking as there is now. Not everybody, the web was around before cell phones, so everybody wasn't walking around with a device that had a GPS tracker on it. Also, we didn't try to tie people's real lives to their user account. So we didn't have all these like single sign-on kinds of things. We didn't have universities creating, you didn't have that identity from the time you were a child that was then associated with your actual information the way that we do now. And so it really has changed in terms of what we do. And really the nature of what we do with digital resources has changed as the web has changed. So we're all growing up. So I've been thinking about this and I actually spent a little bit of time kind of thinking about this because, it's helpful to know where we've come from in terms of where kind of, you have to look back to look forward. So like, where do we come from and where are we going? And sort of in the early days, and these are by no means finite stopping points. I was talking to a colleague the other day and we were talking about sort of the early days of the web and about how the Yahoo had this directory and it was just really a list of links and you would go there and you would read it and you might print it out, but you really couldn't do anything. But during that time, while there was also this very static list of links, just a directory, and that's all you could really do, that was also at the beginning of discussion forums and things like that. So people were starting to try to find ways to communicate with each other, even though most of the web was this very static experience. So, in general, like I said, if if we tried to actually map this out and make it sort of accurate in terms of exactly what was happening at what point in the web, there'd be a lot of overlap, and it wouldn't be just clear buckets. But for the purposes of just generalities, early days of the web, sort of the beginning of the web, was very focused, at least the public web, the internet, was very focused on a more static experience. So people who are creating websites, you could create a website, but you didn't have a lot of places for people to sign up and do anything. There was not this ability to have a bunch of logins and all that kind of stuff. There was starting to, even in the early days, there were some early attempts at blogging and things like that. But overall, it was what some people call the read-write web. You could read things, you could write things, you could share things that way, but there was no share button, there was no social media, none of that existed. One of the things that's most interesting to me is that at that time period, the experience was almost the same for everybody. Now, granted, you had to have a computer that could get on the internet. You had to have internet because it was the days of dial-up. So you had to have internet. And all of those things were expensive and hard to come by if you were in a very rural area, or if you were some place where there just was not technology infrastructure. Certainly you had barriers in that way. So we have not eliminated barriers. We just keep changing the barriers, I think. But in the early days, it was very static. I kind of think of this also as business cards. So people who are creating websites a lot of time was like, hey, here's our business. But you really couldn't do anything with the business. You couldn't shop. You might be able to send an email and say like, hey, that thing that I saw on your website, I'd like to buy, but there was no interactive create a user account, buy things. And then along the way, we had the rise of the social web, or 2.0, as some people called it. It's also the web of community. So this is really where we start seeing a lot of user accounts being created. This is where we start seeing people creating their own identities. And we're starting to see software create identities for us too. This is very focused on authentication, and it's a relationship that, rather than the web coming to us and we can't really do anything with it, there's starting to be an exchange. We are creating content on the web's creating content about us, and Facebook, MySpace, all those things are out there going along. Blogger, people are doing all those things. And now where we are, we have come to the point where not only are we sharing, so it's this back and forth between us and the internet. Now we have the rise of machine learning, and we have the rise of AI, artificial intelligence. And what that means is that all of our data, regardless where it is starting to be shared across these platforms. And this is really, of course, becoming a concern for a lot of people. But the other piece of it is that it is very personalized. So if you're looking on Amazon and you see something that you like on Amazon, and you go over to Zappos, and it was some shoes at Amazon you liked, and you went over to Zappos, you might very well see an ad for that same pair of shoes that you were just looking at. Or, as happened to me last week, you're looking at sofas and you get something in the mail for the sofa company and you didn't even buy anything. So this rise of not only sharing our information, often without our knowledge or consent, but it's being shared across all these various platforms, and they're also making assumptions about us. So it's both a circle and sharing in all directions. Now, I do think we're going to continue to see a lot more discussion about how our data is shared, but it is an interesting standpoint because it does complicate when we start talking about metadata, because there's the metadata that we're creating, the metadata we're using in terms of identities. And then there's also this whole giant bucket of metadata that's being created by artificial intelligence and things like that. On the bottom down here is my continuum of access control, privacy, security, and personal data. And as we've gone from rewrite, where the experience is kind of the same for everybody, even though you can't really do a whole lot, all the way over to you can do, you can ask your smart speaker to do things, you can ask your refrigerator to buy you stuff. I mean, there's all these kinds of things you can do if you have the money and you have the technology support, of course, and the willingness to share all that data. So why is this all important to us? Well, it's important to us because many of us have become or are starting to become aware of our digital identity. And I was looking back through some of my presentations, and I actually have been talking about digital identity since 2008. So this is one of my first topics I was presenting on, was about our digital identity. Now, I was talking about it from managing our personal data and talking about our own digital identity and how we craft those identities. But of course, from a metadata perspective, then there's also, like, for those of us who collect resources about a person or by a person, then how do we take care of that? We have become much more aware of security and privacy issues. And this is really everything from, seeing things be hacked or hearing things about identity theft, or, even being aware or hearing about people being doxxed, where publicly sharing personal information to either try to out somebody, to harass them, to identify a person for a specific reason, to even as sort of a public shaming. So we're really starting to talk about some of these issues in a lot of ways. So I kind of like this little diagram because it's really about managing your own personal identity and kind of thinking about what that means in terms of how you share information and who you share information with. So identity management versus identity management. So getting back to us and our definition and aspects of identity management. So this gets to our Wikipedia of how users gain an identity. So, this is for our little sliver of the metadata world. This is really the critical piece of it. That identity itself. Like, how does that identity happen? Where does that identity come from? And when we need to create or establish an identity, how does that process happen? And of course, as content creators, we're all creating content. If you use any social media, you're a content creator. If you have published anything professionally, or in your local newspaper, or you've written a family newsletter, anything that's on the web, you are a content creator. If you create artwork, or you take photographs, or you do Instagram or any of that stuff, you are a content creator. If you do social media, any social media, you are a content creator. We're also content consumers, of course. We are all going out and consuming this stuff. And of course, we are information professionals. So we are uniquely qualified and uniquely interested in this topic too, to really have some very nuanced conversations about identity and really start driving this conversation forward, because we have an expertise in identities that other communities do not have. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute because it is so important. So one of the things I want you to kind of think about is, what of the kind of work that we do in terms of metadata. And then as we're exploring the work that we do, and we're talking more about that work, to kind of think about the larger community and like how we are part of that and where we can uh, really step up and start being part of this conversation, because we do have a lot of expertise here. So of course, we are looking at the metadata that we're creating, and that can be both what we create personally and also what we create on behalf of, say, our authors. The content that we create or the content they create, and then how we interact with identities. So there are so many layers of identities. We will come back. We won't come back to this diagram again and again, but we will come back to these terms again and again through the next 3 weeks. So entities, that can be systems, persons, organizations, and we're going to talk more about entities, like I said, as we go along. For the purposes of what we're talking about today, if it's easiest for you to think about an entity as a person, go for it. And if that's an easy frame of reference, just start with person, that's good. But entities have identities. So a person has an identity, and they probably have more than one. Identities consist of attributes, and these attributes are characteristics. Now, under the bucket of characteristics, in this little diagram, they actually separate names, identifiers, and characteristics out. From a metadata perspective, characteristics and attributes and characteristics are the very same thing, and a name is a characteristic of a person, right? So a person's name may change over their lifetime. As a child, I had a nickname, and I was called that nickname till I was about 8 or 9. My dad continued to call me that nickname kind of off and on for years and years and years. When my niece was born, she couldn't say ours, and so she used my nickname, and so she continues to call me by my nickname. So, you know, we have these names, and names change, and people do change names over their lives. People get married, people get divorced. You know, people combine communities in different ways, or maybe their name's just been misspelled a lot, or maybe they want to change their name for some reason. And so, you know, it's really not that uncommon for people's names to change. So that there's an example of a characteristic of something that may change. And we're going to look and talk much more about changing metadata next week. We're really going to dive into that. In terms of other characteristics that may change, identifiers are typically meant to not change, at least in terms of what we consider a persistent identifier. And we're going to talk about these more in the upcoming weeks too. But those are really meant to identify people, you know, at least for a specific identity, or perhaps a specific time in their life. So things that would be an identifier for you: your social security number, your driver's license number. Now, in my state, driver's license numbers change, but you know, that driver's license number is unique to me, even though it changed at one point because they decided they wanted to change how they did things. So, you know, that kind of information does sometimes change, but it's still an identifier because it is one name or one number associated with one person, kind of thing. So this also gets to that Wikipedia definition of thinking about systems and tools to manage identifying and that data about entities, and the entities including individuals. So, you know, in terms of thinking about identities, we're thinking about actually the wide scope of identities. So it's beyond people, but people's the easy one, right? It could really be an organization. It could be a group of people doing something together. And we're going to talk more about sort of the different ways we've looked at identities and what we've called them. And of course, then our entities, they have attributes or characteristics. So if you have studied any kind of metadata kind of modeling, you may have seen entities, and you may have seen this: entities have attributes, so they have characteristics. And, you know, that's true. You don't have to put the identities in the middle, but that is what identities are, that those identities are made up of characteristics. So let's just look at some examples of some identities as we kind of talk through this a little bit. So this is an example of an identity that's out on the web, coming from Wikipedia. And you'll notice that it has this disambiguation. And it tells you right here, this article is about the royal title. If you want the musician, you're going to see Prince the musician. And for other users, you're going to see this other entry for Prince. So it's kind of giving you a little bit of information. Like if you're looking for this identity, if you're looking for the musician, look here. So this is one way to manage the identities. because we want to ensure that people can find who they're looking for. The data from Wikipedia actually is drawing from their own identity management tool, I guess would be a good way of saying it, or portal. But this is a collection of records that have been created by different people. And you'll notice here we have all the different names associated with, or not all of them, but quite a few names associated with Prince. And we also then have, description of Prince, and then we have some other kind of information. So label Prince is known as Prince. Now, some things you'll notice here, and we're going to spend a lot more time looking at actual data and records in the upcoming weeks, but I just kind of wanted to give you something to look at. So here we have, this is an item. So this is our identity to represent Prince. This information is then connected into Wikipedia. And the basis of how they determine that, Prince the musician, what characteristics, what attributes does Prince the musician have? Well, he has his name, Prince, so label being his name. And then we have that he's an American singer, songwriter, musician, actor. Some people would say a lot more than that, but that's what they've listed for sort of his roles when he has been performing in English. So these would all be attributes. We also have a bunch of names, other names he's known as. Again, those are some more attributes. And then we have some numbers down here. So these would be his identifiers that are going to link to specific pieces of data about him. Again, those are attributes. We're going to talk much more about identifiers throughout class, and you are going to see the terms entities and attributes again and again, probably. So that's going to be something that we're really going to be talking about. So, why does identity management matter? Like, why are we even interested in talking about this? Well, beyond privacy, security, access, which are very relevant, worthwhile topics, certainly something we should all be thinking about, concerned about. Identity management, especially from a metadata standpoint, serves some other purposes. So it can help us find resources by or about a specific creator. We're looking for Prince his estate has just released or is releasing maybe this week a new album. And so perhaps you have pre-ordered it, or you have the digital download for your library or whatever it may be. Some kind of music database you've subscribed to, and they're going to drop it. And the Prince fans in your area are really excited about this, and they're starting to call the library asking you about it. So you want to be able to find that information so that you can tell them, yes, we will have access to the album when it drops, or no, we don't, but you might check, wherever. So we do have people who want to find resources by or about a specific creator or person. And that's very much like library, like what we do, our bread and butter of libraries, right? People come in, they want to buy, they want to read, or look at whatever it may be, the latest book by the latest book by James Patterson, or whatever it may be. We also sometimes want to explore related resources to that person. So, when we look at Prince, he has a lot of other names he's performed under. And so perhaps we know that he has released some music under Joey Coco, and we want to hear that or see that. Now, some of these kinds of things, I'm kind of using an example here. It's going to really depend upon what your library or organization collects, or if you're a digital archive, what it is that you have in your collection. And in terms of people asking for things, it may be more of what are they searching for, in your digital archive, or what are they searching for on your website, as opposed to somebody actually calling and saying like, hey, the new Prince album's coming out. Are you going to have it? Are we going to have it? So, it can also be, it doesn't have to be necessarily somebody calling. It can also be what people are finding through searching. So people want to find resources and search for things that are by or about a specific creator. Of course, we like to see what else they've done or maybe are related to them. So maybe if you're a big Prince fan and you really like funk music, then maybe you want to see other, you just want to do kind of see what else is related in the funk category or something like that. It can also assist in citation discovery and management. So let's say maybe you are a music student and you are studying Prince's music over the years and sort of his shift between genres. And so you are really trying to figure out like, okay, I need 3 credible resources for my paper tomorrow. And, trying to figure out like how you're going to find those resources. Well, having authorized forms or links to names in our records can be of help in that. It can also assist in an individual's reputation management. I don't think we really think about this one enough, but if you are especially a library faculty member or even a teaching faculty member and you're getting ready for tenure, putting together your dossier, or maybe you just want to kind of tidy up your academia edu or your ORCID account, being able to have those links to resources that you've published, or if you submit works to an institutional repository, having links to those works and being able to pull those resources together can be part of that dossier package. It can show that you have indeed been active publishing or that you have published things or whatever it is that you're trying to do. If you are job hunting and you have, created a lot of, maybe you've created a lot of finding aids, or maybe you have created a lot of readers advisories, or maybe you've done a lot of say even PowerPoint presentations, you put them on SlideShare, being able to kind of say like, hey, you can go look at my stuff here as a way of kind of showing your work and documenting your work can kind of help in terms of showing that, yes, I am qualified and competent in this particular discipline. It can also be helpful for genealogical or historical research related to people. And I think that's especially true when you start looking at historical resources, digital archives, things like that. So identity management and being able to manage at a metadata level the various identities that people have, and to be able to kind of think about, like we saw with that Prince example, how do we bring all those different variations of a name together? How do we ensure that if people are looking for Joey Coco, because they know that he created, you know, he dropped, one pressing of a 7-inch, and that's it. And we want to see that record, and that's very rare and hard to find, but this library has it. Then, how are you going to find that information? Being able to use that metadata, that identity management, and that metadata to connect those two things together to help our patrons find what they're looking for is an incredibly valuable piece of it. So, kind of talked all about this, and I've even used this word already, but I really haven't defined it. So in library cataloging terminology, we often talk about identities along with their accompanying attributes in terms of authority. So when you hear, sometimes you'll hear catalogers say like authorities or authority control, something like they're really talking about what is the authoritative resource, but also that control or management of it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go along. But cataloging has been actually working with identity metadata management for a very, very long time now. Of course, we often use controlled vocabularies, and controlled vocabularies being an established list of preferred or authoritative terms. So it means subject terms that are on a list that has been defined by somebody. I can make my own controlled vocabulary, and I have made my own controlled vocabulary when I've worked on some digital library projects. I can make my own controlled vocabulary and just say, like, you must pick topics off this list. That's fine. That's still a controlled vocabulary. It's just mine. It can be, of course, larger. Controlled vocabulary Library of Congress subject headings is a multi-layer hierarchical listing. So it's like list and list within. Of course, if you've ever dug around the Library of Congress subject headings, you know they're complicated. It can also be something like Getty's Art and Architecture, which is used by a lot of libraries and archives too. So those controlled vocabularies, that's another form authorities. We're really going to be focused on the identity authorities for this particular class. So we're not going to talk much about controlled vocabularies other than just kind of to touch on it, because they do fall for cataloging. They fall under the umbrella of authorities and authority work, but we're not going to focus too much on them. So what's the difference between authority and identity? Well, I've just alluded to it. In terms of cataloging, authority includes subject headings, so those controlled vocabularies, as well as identity management. Identity management, of course, that would just be identities. It wouldn't include those controlled vocabularies. So, we have really been doing this work for an incredibly long time. Subject headings started being developed and implemented in the late 1890s. Dewey was the first, Elsie came later, but it's been around for a very long time. So subjects really came first in terms of looking at this notion of creating authoritative resources and then being able to reference those authoritative resources. Now, in terms of the web at large, this has been this is really a difference in terms of how metadata happens in the larger web world and how it happens in the library world. Part of it is because the web as a whole is really decentralized. Well, less decentralized than it has been in the past, but it really was about decentralized data where anyone, if you had the appropriate technology, could create a website, all that stuff. And in some ways, it was meant to have equitable access. Now, in theory, because as we've talked about, you have to have the equipment, you have to have, even in the early days, you had to have dial-up, all that kind of stuff. Certainly none of that was cheap. So, even though it was everybody could create something on the web, in theory, not everyone could create something on the web. The other aspect of it is that identity management, especially identity metadata management, is a very complex task. And there's really no singular vision of what that work could or should look like. So if you go out and start looking at some web projects where people are talking about authority types of things, you might see people talk about tagging. You don't see people talk about tagging as much as they did, but there was a real effort for a little while for people to tag everything, create a blog and create tags, that sort of thing. You saw tag clouds out as a thing for a while. People have not, in the larger web community, have not quite been as keen on that as they were probably about 10 years ago now. But that was a thing for a while, folksonomies, where people would sort of work on controlled vocabularies together, or maybe community controlled vocabularies, meaning that rather than coming from some a library or coming from an institution or organization, that this vocabulary was really coming from the folks or the people who are working on the project together. Again, you don't see that much anymore. A lot of those sort of early controlled vocabulary projects have sort of gone the wayside. We'll talk a little bit about things that still exist out there, but not too much. So Much when people talk about authorities on the web, traditionally it has been much more focused on controlled vocabularies. It's only really been in the last few years that we're starting to see this discussion about identities. And of course, we've been doing identities for a long time. We do understand that identities are complex, and we're going to have a lot of fun, I hope, next week talking about that. We do have different roles throughout our life, different identities. They can be really dramatic when they shift, or of course, they can just kind of change from the time you're a kid to, as you get older. Um, so, that can make it challenging in terms of metadata. And we'll talk more about that, like I said, next week. Subjects and controlled vocabularies typically reflect the usage of their communities at the time that they're created, and that, of course, oh, I have a typo. That evolves over time. Now, when you think about the Library of Congress subject headings, we talked about, well, library the Dewey started in the 1890s. Library of Congress was about 25 years after that. And one of the things that has happened is as our language has evolved, and especially when we're talking about language in terms of how do we refer to particular demographic groups, or how do we refer to different kinds of work, or any of those kinds of things, that that update process has to happen, and that's a complex process unto itself. So next week, we're really going to dive into those issues of privacy, security, equity, and the ethics of collecting and creating information about people, because it is a very important issue to this. So doing the work, how do we do the work? Well, staffing and training to do this kind of work really varies from library to library, organization to organization. Traditionally, libraries, at least in cataloging, technical services kind of areas, have had some staff who can at least review the data that's there and or maintain the links and text strings. Now, that last part may or may not happen at all. I've worked in large libraries where we had like a whole team of people who did this, worked in large libraries where we outsourced everything, and I worked in large libraries where we hadn't done anything. we just accepted the information as it was and moved on. We didn't do any review or check-in or anything like that. So there's a variety of how this work happens. And there are tools out there, and some ILSs may help in terms of doing this kind of work. And of course, there's some vendors that are out there too that will help with that kind of work. So for cataloging, and when we talk about cataloging in libraries, we're talking about descriptive metadata, and then it also can include some inventory control work. And I think it's one of those things where it's like, we just like to see that cataloging work is descriptive metadata, because that feels like a good connection to the larger metadata world, which it is, but it also has some inventory control aspect. Like sometimes we have to put barcodes on books, that kind of thing. And then of course we have the ILS, the integrated library system. So that's the software. But when we are ordering a book or getting a book, and we're getting that record that's coming to us, the software that we are using is built with the expectation that identity metadata management will happen. Because as a whole, and this may be at a larger level, like not our library, we may not care about this, but as a community, we care about it, and our standards require it. So that is an important piece in terms of at least how libraries and the cataloging community have dealt with identity metadata, is that we have this national level of standards and guidelines that define how identity management happens. And currently we call this authorities. Identities fall under that authorities umbrella. But we have those national standards that define how that work happens and require it in terms of our records. Now, do you have to put identity information into a record? You do not. It is not a required field in terms of MARC fields, but like I said, in terms of kind of a standard, it is required. And as we've seen and already talked about in the IT and the web community, identity management is really often about that user management, user roles, and the identities that are created during that work are often disconnected. Now we're starting to talk more about, the identity that's created, that metadata part of it, and then, the user role, that kind of stuff. So we're starting to talk about how those two things are actually connected. And of course, information that is created in terms of going beyond the user accounts, this includes things that may be voluntary things we create, like our social media posts, our LinkedIn page, that kind of stuff, or it can be involuntary, that information that's created about us or shared about us. And, really for few website owners, unless you're an educational or research institution or maybe a library or archive or something like that, most of them are really not doing any sort of identity management metadata practice. And even controlled vocabularies are not widely used. I mean, we've talked a little bit about controlled vocabularies, and there are some projects out there to use controlled vocabularies. There are some communities that are still pushing controlled vocabularies, which is great, but it's not something that we see adopted, across the web as a whole. So, maybe the Amazon is doing something, but if you're reading a blog from someone, because anyone in theory can still publish on the internet, if you're reading a blog from somebody, then they may not be doing anything with a controlled vocabulary. They may not be using even tags. So they may have a category, or their category may just be chronological and there's no real organization to it. In terms of museums and digital libraries, controlled vocabulary use is much more common, certainly more common than the web. It is typically more common than even identity and name management. And my experience from working with these kinds of technologies and these systems and softwares that are used for digital libraries, institutional repositories, and museums is that controlled vocabularies are sometimes present. I mean, certainly there's subject field, and sometimes it will link out to a controlled vocabulary or maybe do a lookup against a controlled vocabulary. So there is that possibility. But then once you start looking at identities and metadata, it just becomes much, much less common. And there's often just not as much help in the software itself. So I think this is one area that has been a little bit of struggle, especially for cataloger metadata workers, people who work with the ILS, and maybe people who then work with, say, an institutional repository software or digital archive software, is that the expectations you may have as a cataloger for the software is, well, I will have some controlled vocabulary, I will have some way to look up my subjects or some place to put a subject. And then I'll have that same sort of place to put information about my names. And there is a place to put names, but it doesn't usually support sort of linking out to anything else, or like we saw with the Prince record, where it showed all the different names. We just don't see as much of that kind of stuff in these kinds of softwares. Now, we are starting to see more of it, but it has not been baked in as much as it was in like library catalog stuff. So when using controlled vocabularies, or we might be using sources to verify, and we may call this by a few different things. We may say we're going to verify identities, we're going to check identities, we're going to validate names. And that could be automated. So there may be some system that validates or checks or verifies, or it may be something that we do manually, where we're going to go look it up and see, is it in this authoritative resource? And if it is, what is the form of the name? How is the name represented? So we have choices especially when working with digital archives, institutional repository type of software. If you're working in the ILS, your choices for identity management has more or less been made for you. You're going to follow the Library of Congress's name authority file. If you're working in a digital archive, institutional repository type of software, or museum type of software like a knowledge management software, and you have the ability to put names in and then have those represented in some way, then you will need to make that choice about which one you're going to use, which authoritative resource you're going to use, and then how that work's going to happen. You'll also have to make a choice, and this is true for library catalogers as well, is if you look in your authoritative resource and there is no match. So, you know, we look in our authoritative resource and, um, you know, you're looking for Robin Say and there's no Robin Say listed, then what do you do? How are you going to represent that name? What standards are you going to follow? And really, many of these decisions are driven by the software and a lot of times by the software limitations. So if libraries have been doing this work for so long, this is my question. Why do others not follow our lead or connect into our resources? And I think there's a lot of positive things about what cataloging has been doing, and of course there's a lot of negative things about what cataloging has been doing. But I do think there is a certain threshold of knowledge that you need to have in order to really understand sort of all the nuances of cataloging, especially for authority. So knowledge experience. So if you're working on a website, or maybe you're working in digital archives or institutional repository, you may not even realize that cataloging is doing some identity management, or you may not understand what authorities is if you hear that term. Or you may just not really understand like how it could work with what you're doing. So there's that piece of it, understanding what cataloging is doing to see whether or not you can use any of the workflows or any of the resources. Like, is there stuff from that aspect of metadata work that you can apply to what you're doing? And I would love to see more intersection between the two. I would like to see more metadata workers looking to traditional cataloging to see whether or not there are things traditional catalogers are doing that are applicable. And I would really, really, I keep hoping that one day catalogers will do the opposite and sit down with their digital library archivist or museum workers or other metadata workers and kind of look at what they're doing in terms of metadata work and see what is applicable. Now, I will say for the cataloging side of it, you know, we're really stuck in MARC still. And so although there's things that we might really love to do and implement that digital archives are doing, given our system limitations, we may not be able to do those things. So, you know, system limitations on both sides really does drive some of what we can do in terms of metadata work. So other things that are, you know, may prevent people from even thinking about what catalogers are doing or whether or not they want to do that, time, knowledge, and experience to do the work. Like, how does this work even happen? Access to appropriate controlled vocabularies or name authority resources. There is something called the Virtual Internet Authority File, and we'll be looking at that later. This is really only for use for nonprofits, so nonprofit projects. So if you are a commercial company, it's not licensed for you to use. If you are a nonprofit, you want to use it, you could use those resources though. We already talked about software and system limitations, and then sort of ethical questions like, do we want to be doing this? How would we be doing it? All that kind of stuff. And then finally, I would say that for cataloging, you know, a lot of times, especially if you're talking to people in the larger web community, or maybe you're talking to people in the semantic web community, or even go to some IT thing, they don't really see cataloging in terms of like how it fits in with larger web metadata. It's just sort of a library thing. And so I think too, those silos can sometimes really be a barrier. I would say the other thing is really a factor is when you start talking about the larger web, it relies on so much automation, and it really is starting to rely on machine learning and artificial intelligence to do things. I've even seen some um, sort of attempts to use artificial intelligence to determine like topics and subjects for photographs. So it's been an interesting project to watch. Uh, but it's really only been the past few years we're starting to see sort of things like single sign-on or the ability to sign in using a social media account on multiple platforms, that kind of thing, using pass-through systems to reduce multiple identities. So in the olden days, if you had 5 software, you had 5 different user accounts and 5 different passwords. And someday people will know that world never again. Now, is that a good thing or bad thing from a privacy, security issue? Is it good for all those things to be connected together? Maybe not. From an ease of access and only having one login kind of thing, it's kind of nice. And of course, the other piece of it is that software evolves as the web evolves and as everything starts to evolve. So we really are starting to see this conversation about identity metadata, and not even so much a conversation, because you have to look for the conversations a little bit. But we're starting to see identity metadata management projects um, are becoming much more robust, and there's starting to be collaborative projects between like libraries and Wikidata or TPpedia and institutional repositories or something like that. So these are resources that are authoritative resources that have, as we looked at Prince's record, if we want to call that a record, but as we looked at Prince's data, there are projects out there like that where they are starting to not only try to standardize information and how information's presented about identities, but then they're also starting to try to collaborate to make their resource better and more of an authoritative resource. And then, of course, that's beneficial to everybody. Even when you look at Amazon, if you go look at like the Amazon author pages, and as an author, you can claim your page and you have the ability to do some metadata work there. So even, even in Amazon, they're starting to kind of look at how identities are represented. So we're likely to see much more of this, and we're likely to see things more like lookup tools, where if you start typing in a subject or name, it'll pop up and tell you what that name is. We'll see that in action when we actually look at look at some of these tools and things like that. We'll actually see that happen. And, I think one of our other advantages is that, one, our scope of work differs dramatically between the larger web. So, we usually have a set quantity of data and information, and the metadata description is really based upon the resources we own. So it's getting or collect. So it's getting to that sense of inventory control aspect. Like, we're not trying to describe everything in the world. We only want people to be able to find those resources typically that we have curated, or that we've collected, or that we've acquired, purchased, however we have collected those resources. So our set of resources is smaller than the whole world. And we also have those standards in there in place too. And for better or worse, we have that MARC formatting, or maybe if we're in a digital library, we have like XML or RDF or something on that side. And so we have some formatting that is kind of helping structure what we do. We do want people to be able to find things by and about the creators that they're looking for, and also subjects. And so, when our users are searching, one of the things they're probably going to be most likely to search for is like subjects, or we might call them keywords, word names. And our systems have been very sophisticated in some ways, in other ways, not so much, but very sophisticated in terms of they're typically weighting or ranking more heavily things that we would consider sort of authorized fields. So this would be things where we would be linking to say, Prince's Wikidata record, or if we're in a MARC record, we might be linking to the LC name authority file for Prince. And so our systems make those have a lot more weight in terms of relevance ranking. So when people are searching, that's just naturally part of it. Whereas the web search algorithms, like Google search algorithm, is a very closely guarded secret. If you there's a lot of people who just totally analyze it and are speculating about how it works and things like that. Google does provide some guidance in terms of sort of webmaster best practices for them, and does seem to just really weight content. So it's really looking at the content of a whole versus specific fields. And this is my little side of my own little rant, but I feel like SEO, search engine optimization, as it's called, and really that was trying to get your website to be on the front page of Google, you know, in that first search, or maybe at the top of the first search. Now, of course, now you can kind of buy your way to things and stuff. So, you know, there's ranking, sponsored ads, and search results above other things. That certainly happens, or happens now. And in the early days, it didn't happen. That really didn't exist. However, there was what they call black hat SEO. And this was really about hijacking search results, or what they would call keyword stuffing. So in a website, there is a place where you can actually put some code in, and people would just like put a gazillion keywords in for things that weren't related at all. So maybe you might be searching for dogs, and instead you would click on a website and it would be a travel website, that kind of thing. Google, it's really hard to find examples of this anymore because Google will ban people for life for doing this. So a lot of the early days of shady things that people did in terms of metadata really ruined, in my opinion, any collaborative attempt between libraries and the larger web community to really bring those some metadata best practices into the web community. They just really took things like keywords or subjects or even names, and they would just, you know, they would just misuse those fields entirely. And like I said, just literally, it just ruined it. Because then what happened is that Google and other search engines decided, well, for one thing, we're going to ban you if you keep doing this, or if you do this, but we're just not going to index these. So we're not going to look at keywords. We're not going to look at structured metadata that's, you know, follows what would be sort of similar to a library standard. You know, we're just not going to look at that. And we're really going to focus on like the description itself and on the content itself. And, you know, then we'll focus on some other things like whether or not you pay us for your search results, those kind of things. So there are still some efforts out there to, you know, to collaborate between the larger web world and like us, our community, in terms of projects, but it's really not focused as much on the metadata as it is focused on more like a little bit on controlled vocabulary, some, but really more on looking at collaborating on these like larger identity management resources like Wikidata, as opposed to like individual projects. There are some individual projects out there, and we are starting to see discussion about identity metadata management. So although I say that SEO ruined metadata, I am very hopeful that as we are continuing to talk about identities as a whole, and we're really looking at identity management beyond those user roles and accounts, although that's important, but we are starting to actually talk about identities on the web, then I'm hopeful that we're going to have much more discussion about this and much more opportunity. But all of the misuse of metadata, because Google and other search engines in the early days were actually looking at that metadata that people were putting into their websites behind the scenes, but it was there. that really de-incentivize the metadata management in larger communities because, they just didn't look at it anymore because it just kept getting misused. So throughout this class, we're going to look at some of those projects on the web that are building those identity resources. We already talked a little bit about Wikidata. We're going to look a lot more at these. We are starting to partner together to publish identity resources authorities, if that's an easier fit for you. We do have the Virtual Internet Authority file, which is a collaborative project. The Library of Congress releases both their subject headings and their names as a linked data service so that those can be used. There's been some interesting discussions about whether or not anybody can use those. So I think we're going to continue to see some discussions about that. And then there's other projects that are non-library organizations such as Wikidata. We're going to explore those resources much more in week 4. So as we've discussed, traditional cataloging really is sort of been the heart of where identity metadata management has happened. And we do have those national centralized rules and guidelines that kind of tell us what to do. And that's probably one of the biggest differences between us and the web. The other part of it is that we do have training as you're doing here, but if you are doing original cataloging, if you are participating in the identity management program, the authority program, that is the NAME program, then you are having national level training. You actually have to go through a whole training process and your records have to be reviewed at a national level before you can submit them to the Library of Congress's National Authority file. So that's another piece of it that's really different from sort of traditional cataloging versus some of these other communities where not only the level of training that happens, but also the level of sort of review and vetting that happens. I've already talked a little bit about this, but I did want to kind of go through the terminology that we've used with authorities, and we'll kind of talk through it a little bit as we go along. We're not going to spend too much of time on sort of traditional library authorities, but it is an important piece because this is one place where we're already doing this kind of work. And like I said, I do know that some of you in digital archives, institutional repositories are probably already starting to do some of this work as well. And you're following what your best practices would be, and you might be using Wikidata, you might be using the Library of Congress Name Authority file. One of the nice things about working with digital archives or institutional repositories, you can choose which one of your authoritative resources you want to use, and you may use more than one. So you have that ability and that flexibility to do that. Again, system limitations on your side may make it harder to do that kind of work, or it may make it easier. On the cataloging side of the house with the MARC records, you're limited in terms of what you can do, but that data is typically there. So we describe resources and metadata, and we sometimes put these in a MARC bibliographic descriptive metadata record. So that's typically a bibliographic descriptive record is typically descriptive metadata, but it does have a little bit of inventory control aspect associated with it, typically like in the item or barcode record. Digital archives, of course, do not typically use MARC records, but you have XML, or you might be using RDF or some other format. And then in terms of those actual authoritative resources, and I've already kind of alluded to this already, but in a MARC record, you might most commonly, you'll see a text string, but you may also have links to an authoritative resource, which may be another record, like we're looking at that example of the Prince record. In bibliographic records, we sometimes call these text strings or links to that authoritative resource. We call those authorized access points. I would say this term has not caught on as much as they might have liked to have hoped, but that's what we call it. A bibliographic record, just for those of you who haven't worked with these kind of records, so when you look in a library catalog, you're typically seeing a bibliographic record first. And this describes the title itself. So this is the title, the author, the extent of it, like how much of it, how big it is, the subject headings, and other attributes. So this would be like an example of OCLC record, a record in your library catalog, a digital library record, if it's that descriptive piece of it. Some ILSs actually have their own built-in authority file. So they have their own little database within that ILS that will collect all of these little authority records. An authority record, we looked at one with the Prince record, the Wikidata Prince record. An authority record describes a person, place, or for cataloging's purposes, a title. And it includes attributes, those characteristics. For traditional MARC cataloging, there's quite a long list, and we're going to dive into these records in week 3. I didn't want to get too far in the weeds today, but attributes include the birth date of the author. It includes biographical information. It includes their address sometimes, and we're going to talk more about that. And it includes other attributes. Now, we looked at an example with the Prince record for Wikidata. So that is a project that's not a library project, although libraries have now worked with them on their authoritative resources. Another example would be the Library of Congress authority records. And we're going to really spend time with these records in week 3. So these authoritative resources usually link to, they could link to a controlled vocabulary, or they could link to a representation of a name. And that would be like some of the things we just looked at. So we've already talked about these, but I wanted to give you a little bit more of a clear definition of them and more of a cataloger-like definition of them, because cataloging has actually defined these, and we're starting to see these definitions also pop up like in Dublin Core and some other things. So for those of you working with institutional archives, or maybe you're working with a digital archive, you're going to start seeing these terms pop up too. Entities, work, expressions, manifestations, items. Okay, so for catalogers, the work, expression, manifestation, items, they probably know what all of those things mean. That is just, you can kind of squish all those together and just think of items or titles. Person, families, corporate bodies, as identified by the entity's attributes or characteristics. Okay, now corporate bodies for cataloging purposes is the term that we use when we have a group of people working together. And it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they make money. And I really hope one day we get rid of that term. I have been hoping for years and it never goes away. So examples of attributes, we've already looked at these: birth, death date, language of the person, corporate body, language of the corporate body. So that would be language that the group is using in their materials. So, you know, if you have a book that's written in English, then the language and the corporate body, or say the committee, is you know, University of Florida faculty committee, and it's the faculty committee papers. Then the University of Florida faculty committee is the corporate body, and they're writing in English because, you know, that's their umbrella, and their content's written in English. And so you would say their language associated with them is English. Now, does that get sticky? Perhaps they write in multiple languages, or they have their materials translated. Definitely. So, you know, these attributes, although they sound very easy on the surface, they can get sticky when you start really thinking about them. Place of residence or headquarters, fuller form of the name, if somebody's abbreviated their name, all of those kinds of things. These attributes do appear in authority records, and as we looked at the example of Prince's record in Wikidata, you know, it said that he was a songwriter and actor and all those things. Those attributes appear in his record too. Some other terms that you will hear me say on occasion, and you will see on occasion: preferred name. And this is the basis for the authorized access point, but this is really what the person wants to be known or called by. So in In the publishing days, when you work with the publisher actually asks you, what do you want? How do you want your name to appear on the title page? How do you want your name to appear on the cover? And you fill out a little form and you write down what your name is. And sometimes they ask you other information like, what's your gender or birth date or whatever, and you can either include it or choose to ignore it. But you have to give them your name or what name you want to be published under. And so that information that is provided to the publisher, if you do not have an authority record already set up or identity record already set up for your name, then when the cataloger is cataloging, they have to make some decisions about how your name will be represented. And typically they're going to take it from how it appears on the book because that's what you've turned into the publisher. So for published work, the preferred name is not complicated. It gets complicated when you have things like a collection of letters from a person where you don't have their name presented to you in any way, and you have to then kind of figure out what that will be. Or maybe it's a person whose name has changed. And if there's an authority record, that's the easy answer. You can follow what's in the authority record because it will tell you what that person's preferred name is. So, this can get a little bit sticky when you start kind of dissecting it for situations where it's not works that have gone through sort of the traditional publishing cycle. Authorized access point in a MARC record. This is a combination of the preferred name with any attributes. So that's a combination of the preferred name. And then we have something called relator codes, and relator codes or relator terms are just the cataloger is making a decision about how that person is connected to that work. Robin Fay is the writer, or the author. So author would be the term that I would use for that. Or, Robin Fay is the illustrator. So I'm going to use illustrator for that. We're going to look at records and spend a lot of time with records lately. We're just kind of getting through terminology here. Differentiate. We already saw this, sort of this notion when we were looking at prints where it said disambiguate, which is a very similar kind of term, but like, how are you going to separate these out? Disambiguate, we're going to clearly separate these out so you know which one is, which is Prince royalty and what is Prince the musician. And you notice that Prince the musician had musician and parens next to it. That's Wikidata and Wikipedia's pattern for what they do for musicians. Differentiate is to break or avoid a conflict. Each name is unique. And that's true when we looked in Wikipedia too, right? They said disambiguation. So we're going to tell you that these things are different. So they're doing this work, but they're telling you that we're disambiguating that we're going to make these things different. For cataloging purposes, we most frequently add this in the authority information by adding attributes to the name. And one of the most common you'll see is dates. So for my name, it would be Faye, Robin M, and then it would be my birthday. Or since there's not there are others of me now, but the time mine was created, there wasn't. It will have other information. Different communities define the type of authorities differently, or the type of identities differently, even when they use the same resource for verification. So for library cataloging, our authorized topic list. So what are our authorized topics going to be? Our subject headings. Those come from a controlled vocabulary list, and that is typically the Library of Congress subject headings. There are other Library of Congress thesaurus that we may use, and there's some other thesauri we use out there too, like the Sears children's subject headings, things like that. So we refer to those as subject or genre headings. Other communities may call them something completely different. So they may call their topic headings subjects, keywords, or even topics, and they may or may not validate, check, control, manage them in any way. For cataloging purposes, and this is for more traditional cataloging, Keywords are any non-controlled. And when I say non-controlled, what does that mean? It means they've not been validated, they're not checked, or they're not linked to an authority record. So any of those things are not true. So, as we continue to partner with the larger web world, and we're considering integrating our resources and really becoming part of the web world, we're starting to really shift our terminologies in terms of what we are thinking about. Traditionally, names, identities were broken into groups of people, and we already talked about corporate body there, which is the world's worst name. Individuals, personal names, and then meetings and things that were event-oriented, and then families. Until around 2017, there was no hierarchy of organization of these categories. They were just sort of categories in authorities. And in 2017, we started looking at how we were going to model. And this is really for traditional cataloging, but it's meant to reach out to archives and museums as well. So really looking at how we model data at the highest level. So this is a data model map or a concept map. This isn't like, what information do I put into this field? It's not that kind of information. It is, if I'm thinking about my data at that very conceptual level, how does this data work together? How does it fit together? And so this is just one piece of the hierarchy in the map. There's also a whole section for like the descriptive metadata stuff. So descriptive metadata stuff aside from the identities. So I have just pulled out the little section that deals with identities, and all the other stuff that's down below or adjacent to this, I have not included. So this is just one little piece of this. If you are interested in this, this is coming from the library reference model, and I will share some stuff about the library reference model for those of you who are interested in learning a little bit more about this. So in around 2017, we started re-examining sort of our conceptual models for data modeling that we had developed, I think around 2007-ish. So it's been about 10 years. And there were some problems. For one, we had 3 data models. So we had a data model for bibliographic descriptive metadata. We had one for identities, and we had one for subjects. And they were developed at different times. And even though they were related to each other, it was kind of hodgepodgey because different people were on different committees that wrote these 3 models, and they were not the same. They were not parallel exactly. And there was no relationship in terms of like a map between all 3 of them. Well, there was kind of a map, but it was okay, I'll just leave it at that. It was sort of a map. It was the world's hardest to follow map in the whole world. I'll just say that and move on. So 2017, we decided as a community that we really needed to start looking at those. And one of the things, of course, we were starting to sort of talk about was linked data and all this kind of stuff and what the web's doing and all that stuff. And then really looking at identities very critically. And so RES, we had to have a bucket for everything in the universe of resources. Like, what would you call all the things out there you could that you might be able to collect? What would you call that? Dewey calls it the universe of knowledge, like what's out there that we could collect, the universe of knowledge. Well, they came up with res, which is Latin for thing. And so they kind of put that at the top category, like what is our universe of resources? And then underneath that, there's one section that's for the bibliographic stuff. There's one section that's for the subjects. And then this section is for identities. So like I said, we're just we're just one section under our universe of resources. So looking at our universe of resource, we started looking at, what terminology we're using, and you see corporate bodies still there. Anyway, we started looking at our language in terms of what we are referring to and thinking about how things fit together. So for identities, we're using the term agent, and that's sort of for all of our identities. And then we divide that between an individual, which is a person, or a collective agent being a group of people. So agent being kind of all authorities or all identities. And then, of course, an individual is a person. And then a group of people is a collective agent. And then underneath that group of people, we have families. And then we have my corporate body. So we have those things. So that's sort of how we started breaking up our identity management. And we have really, in the last couple of years, really been examining this data model and really starting to talk about identity management beyond, certainly beyond what other people have been doing with identity management, but really talking about that metadata aspect of it and talking about authorities as part of that identity management and how we fit into identity management. And if you have looked at Dublin Core or you are using Dublin Core, you may have already been seeing the term agent and collective agent. There is that overlap with Dublin Core in terms of terminology. And there's going to be, as cataloging moves forward, for those of you who do more traditional cataloging, you will start seeing these terms too. So heads up for those of you catalogers. And for those of you who have been working with Dublin Core and stuff, you're already starting to see the term agent, and you're probably already starting to see the term collective agent, certainly in the Dublin Core manuals that you may be looking at. Of course, people have data and connections too. And a long time ago, I did this kind of fun mapping thing that would look at all your social media and then kind of map you into topics you talked about, which I kind of just put like more of my art stuff in there. So it was kind of more of the art stuff, but information technology, that's where the cataloging metadata stuff got put into a bucket. And actually, if you clicked on it, it actually would break down and show you like cataloging and stuff like that. And the connection with my social media at the time, and I don't even know which social media thing that was over there anymore. But then my videos were like more web design and more design kind of stuff. And then my photography and kind of like how those connections happened. And what I loved about this, and I was so sad when this went away, but I guess it was because I had to have access to all your social media to do it, is that it shows those connections and data relation points that we have, with all the different identities we create and all the different things that we create on the web. And so as catalogers, we've been starting to look at this more too, like how looking at people and identities more in a holistic sense in terms of like all the things that they may work on and how those things are linked together. Typically, we have had much less links in our library catalog and metadata records in the past than we could, but we're starting to really kind of think about that. So in MARC bibliographic records, we typically have used text strings for our identity-related fields, and they may or may not be linked to an authority record. So for example, we have a 100 field, so this would be for the author of the book. 100 field, and I'm not going to go into all the MARC coding, but we have some MARC coding there. And then it's Flanagan Terry. So Terry Flanagan is the author of this particular book. And of course, there'd be much more in this record besides that. Names in a MARC bibliographic record and an authority record are typically inverted. There are times when they are not inverted, but the majority of the time for a person's name, they're going to be inverted. So that's a text string, Flanagan, Terry. Yeah, there's some coding up there, but that little bunch right there, the Flanagan Terry, is a text string. Remember we were talking about you could add that relationship or that relator term to it. there's that author right there. So subfield E for author. Subfield E is the subfield for the relator code. Subfield means it is, we have this 100 field, so that's the mark field. And then subfield is literally a field within that. So, and it's defined, and there's a whole gigantic mark guideline, and it's actually defined in that for those relator codes. So Flanagan-Terry is a text string. This matches the formatting of the preferred name from the authority record. So if I went and go out to the Library of Congress National Authority file as a cataloger, that'd be where I would go first, and I would find that, and I would see that, yes, indeed, it matches. Now, I can, as a cataloger, or I might just not worry about it, but you are seeing more and more of these relator codes, and this is something that the cataloger supplies, because they are the one looking at the resource and making the decision about what is that person's relationship to that specific work. Because of course, people are different. So when we were looking at Prince, he's like, sometimes he's a songwriter, or sometimes he's a producer, or sometimes he's an actor. So he has different roles and different relationships with different works. If he is listed in as being part of the cast in New Girl, that's going to be in a different role than Purple Rain. So his roles are going to differ, his actual roles, not only in life, but in not only what he plays on TV, but in terms of his metadata are going to differ. The challenge to the text strings that is, if if Terry's name changes, then what happens? Well, it's got to get fixed, right? So if her name changes and she decides that she wants to prefer a different name, she tells the publisher, she tells her publicity agent, she tells everybody, I want to be Terry, Terri. Let's get rid of that Y. She decides she's going to do that. She changes everything. Then that needs to be changed. So once the authority record changes, once that preferred form of the name changes, then this data needs to be changed. So if Terry's name changes, we have to manually update it. Now, there are tools out there that will do this work for you and stuff like that, but it still has to be done. It's not an automated process unless you outsource to a vendor, and even they have to do work. It just seems automated for you. And if we want to build searches, like more dynamic searches, like we want to do like all Terrys who are writers and things like that, text strings just make this much harder to do. Or we could just link to the authority record, and then the system could display the name. So the system could still show to the user, or we're searching, it could still show us Flanagan, Terry. But then if we looked on the code side, or we looked on the mark record side of it, we'd just see a link. So just like a website, our code can be separated from the display. And this is something that cataloging, to me, is kind of a missed opportunity, where we kind of still show people. I mean, we've tried to be better about it and not show them so much mark coding. And now you have to kind of look behind the scenes to see the mark coding stuff a little bit. But we could do a lot more of this, where we're kind of separating out so it doesn't feel so, library jargony. And we're working on it. So linked data is a mechanism to facilitate data sharing and quality. You can kind of think about it as a bridge. It is literally linking data together. It is exactly what it says it is. That's one of the few terms that is exactly what it says it is, linking data together. The process of linking itself also builds a relationship. So it both is the bridge between two pieces of data, and it itself is a linking or data point. So we're looking at my little map of kind of social media, art stuff, and all those links and stuff, linking all that stuff together. Each one of those links is also a potential data point. So, certainly for websites, for digital archives, for institutional repositories, all that kind of stuff, linking to an authoritative resource like Wikipedia or Wikidata or any of those kind of things, even to an author profile page, any of that kind of stuff, all of that can, uh, it can do a couple of things. One, you can reduce having to fix those kind of things. So if Terry Flanagan's name changes, you don't have to fix that kind of thing. And then it can also be a way to kind of enrich that information. So maybe you're going to, in addition to linking to, say, the Library of Congress subject heading, or sorry, the Library of Congress name authority file for Terry Flanagan, then maybe in addition to that, you would also link to her Amazon author page or something like that. So you could also provide kind of value added stuff too. So what does this look like in a MARC record? I kind of said, like, I've been talking about MARC. We didn't really look too much about MARC. We're not really going to go into a bunch of MARC stuff. I can share some other MARC resources for those of you who are interested in it, but you know, this is identity management. It's not MARC. Aren't you glad? We're not going into all that. But what I do want you to kind of pay attention to is when you look here at the 100 field, there's that text string, Flanagan, Terry. Now, this is designed by Terry Flanagan, so we could put something there. We could put a relator code there. This person who created this record chose not to do that. That's fine. It's not required. And then if you look over here, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, but if you look over here, and this is a BibFrame Turtle record, so you'll hear Turtle again this week. Then if you look here, you can actually see there's that relator code. There's the information about the relator, and it's kind of hard to see that. But then if you look up above it where it says BF agent, so BF being for BibFrame, so that's, you know, kind of telling a system that would read this very code-oriented record, like what you might see on a website, but that BF tells you that it's BibFrame, and then there's our agent. So this is part of that agent class. And then rather than having Flanagan Terry, we actually have just the link to that. So this would still display, or could still display to the public if we went and looked at this BibFrame Turtle record. We'd still see, you know, author Flanagan Terry, but on the back end of it, we would see just the link. So that's the other piece of it, is like separating the display from the, you know, from the code. So one of the things we're really looking, as at least as metadata workers, that we're really starting to look at in identity management, besides these sticky issues of like privacy and dynamic, you know, dynamic metadata, and you know, how do we handle these sort of sticky issues, sort of ethical issues with metadata? So that's certainly a big piece of it. But beyond that is looking at how we can start linking to data, linking to more data, instead of having to type out, you know, Flanagan, Terry, or even copy and paste, whatever it may be, but how we can just link to it so that we don't have to keep cleaning it up and fixing it and changing things. Sort of looking at Dublin Core record, text strings. So this might be like something you would see coming out of a digital archive or institutional repository kind of record. Yeah, we're not going to go into all the code view things. I just wanted to kind of point out that text string, there we have a text string for the creator, and the creator being the term that is used, you know, for that individual or group that is responsible for that particular item. And then if you look down here in the subjects, it's linking to, so it's not linking actually to the term itself, but it is linking to the vocabulary. So at least it's telling the system, you know, here's the vocabulary that we're using. So not exactly linked data, but is linking to the Library of Congress subject headings and saying which thesaurus it's using, and then it's using a text string there as well. Now we could, since the Library of Congress subject headings have been issued as linked data, we could actually replace that. If our system would do that work, we could replace that with the link to rap music. And then if the term rap music would change for some reason, we wouldn't have to worry about updating. So that's kind of how that works. So that's really the two big things I would say that we're really starting to look at with identity management is like all these sticky issues we'll be talking about next week, and then also how we can really start leveraging linked data for identities, and then really thinking about identities less from sort of that cataloging centric viewpoint of authority work and more from that larger identity management aspect, which is why you're here. So I want to talk a little bit more about linked data and about URIs because you're going to see these terms as we go along too. So Tim Berners-Lee, who's considered to be the founder of the internet, he came up with 4 rules. These have been around for a long time. And when you think about what we've talked about so far, we have hit on every single one of these rules. So it would be nice if the web as a whole would embrace all of these. If they would just embrace these 4 rules, this would make the internet so much better in terms of how things work. So use URIs, and a URI is a uniform resource identifier, and we're going to look exactly what that means in a minute. A URL is a form of a URI. So you could say if your URL makes you, if URL works better in your brain to just translate it, because really that's going to be what we're going to be using, because in order to use linked data, you have to use what? A link. So that means we're going to be focused on a link, which would be the URL part of this. So you use URIs as names for things. So instead of putting Flanagan Terry, we're going to use a link. Well, there's our first rule. Actually, our first rule is to use the URI as a name. So we do have a URI as a name where Flanagan Terry, since that's linking to an authoritative resource, that's fine, but we're going to use the link. Then the second rule, so we could really, for our perspective, we could really combine 1 and 2 together because we are going to focus on the linked data part of it. So combine 1 or 2 together. So 2, use HTTP URIs. That would be a URL. So that's a link. Use a link so that people can look up those names. Well, I mean, that's number 2 right there with the agent. When someone looks up a URI, so when they could either look it up by actually going and looking it up, or in our case, we're going to use a link so they can just click on the link and go directly there. When they go there, when someone goes to look up a URI, provide useful information using standards. The information that is presented in that record, such as a Library of Congress authority record, such as a Wikidata record, should have some standards. I mean, this just makes so much sense, right? When those identity records are created, they should be created with some standards. So we should have an identity record. So applying this to identities, we should have an identity record. That identity record should have a link that we can use. And if somebody goes to look at that identity record, like our example of the Brent's record, that record should be formatted to standards. And then the final thing, which is kind of a nicety, which we are starting to think about, but we haven't done as much with as we could, is to include links to other things so that people can discover more things. This is about building those relationships. So including those other things. So this has been around for a long time, but we are starting to do this in the real world in terms of metadata work, and especially in terms of identity management. So this is one of these things that I think is really confusing, and I love this little diagram because I think it lays it out pretty quickly. So a URI is just a uniform resource identifier. That's just a resource identifier that's out there that you can see or access or whatever. And the different pieces of it are kind of broken out. So a URL, that's essentially the link part of it. And what they would call the URN is kind of this whole piece of it, kind of the whole thing. But the URL is the location part of it. So really all you need to know about URIs from a linked data standpoint is that a URI is going to be a link. And it should be a unique link, because you don't want to, if I go to look at Prince's authority record, I don't want to click on the link for it and I get taken to 5 other things. I want to click on that link and go to Prince's identity record, go to that Wikidata record, and then I might want to see other things from there. Maybe I want to go see Joe Coco. Maybe I want to go see the purple, whatever he did as the purple one. But I'm going to want to first go to that. So, example, looking at the virtual internet authority record, like I said, we're going to spend a lot more time looking at this kind of stuff. Here you see his virtual internet authority, international authority file. I think I called it internet earlier, but anyway, virtual international authority file. I do know what it is. I'm just tongue-tied. You see down there this permalink, that is the URI for this. And it is a URL, so you can link directly to that. So I wouldn't get too hung up on like the difference between a URI and a URL, because for the purposes of linked data, we are going to be using a URL. A URL is just the address. That is just the link. So that's really all you need to know about that. So URIs, we're starting to really think about how we're going to do that and use that in our identity management work. It helps to establish the knowledge about an object. And part of that knowledge can be those relationships, which we've already talked about. And really and it can be concepts or facts or really kind of anything. It's really about that body of knowledge. But the most important aspect of the URI is that it's really information that's not for us as people. It's information that's for the machine. So that's that URL part of it. Like if you just look at a URL, I mean, it's not really going to tell you anything. This URL is going to tell you nothing. However, in our systems, we could put this URL in and it's going to show us Prince. It's going to say Prince 1958 to 2016. And then if we go click on, maybe we click on Prince as a creator, Prince as a musician, or Prince as an actor, however it's listed, it's going to show us those things by him. And you see down here, of course, different authoritative resources list different attributes, but there's some of Prince's attributes there, other forms of his name. We have, he's an American musician, producer, and performer, that kind of thing. So different systems are going to list different things. Linked data, URIs, so that URL are the bridge that allows systems to share and understand the information. And instead of using that instead of a text string, as we did with Flanagan Thierry, would eliminate that text string maintenance if those names change. So can we put these in MARC records? Can we put linked data in MARC records? The answer is yes. Now, there's been a moratorium kind of going on because they're still trying to figure out exactly what we're going to do. I just want to answer the question for those of you who may be catalogers or looking at traditional cataloging. Yes, we can do this for identities and cataloging, and we actually have a subfield. Remember, a subfield is a field within a MARC field. So they've actually defined where they would go in a MARC record, and they've divided them into 2 categories. The first category, which is the 0, means an really authoritative resource. And so this would be like a Library of Congress National Authority file. And it can be a number. It can be the National Authority file number, or it can be a URL and be linked data. And then the other one is subfield 1, and they call these real world objects. And basically this is anything else a person might have a relationship to. So for example, if for my little tiny book that I wrote a long time ago, it's about kind of social media, technology, semantic web kind of stuff. But if somebody wanted to link to, if somebody wanted to link to an article I published in a scholarly journal, sort of as a supplemental thing, or maybe something that people might be interested in as related, it's not going to be something that's going to be an authoritative resource, at least according to our group of standards here, but that would be something that might be of interest. So we could put in a subfield 1 as a real world object. So a real world object is just other, for cataloging purposes in terms of how we're viewing this, it's just other resources related to identities that are not one of our authoritative resources. So we're going to dive more into record data in week 3. We're just kind of seeing what we're doing right now. So practices and cataloging. Practices cataloging brings to identity management. Certainly, we have a good understanding of the evolving concepts and the complexities of identity metadata and the relationships between people and their data. We do have that depth expertise in metadata management, especially as applicable to identities. We do have resources to validate and manage identity metadata, and we are starting to use linked data, but this is far from the norm, but we're starting to. And, why we're not leaders in this? Well, for catalogers, that's MARC, or MARC is one of our problems. Our terminology and language is outdated. We are starting to move forward on that, really looking at how we think about things. We really have focused on resources we collect, so our inventory, and this is such sort of it's really an unspoken or an unacknowledged part of cataloging work, that so much of it, especially our policies in terms of how our work happens, is really driven based upon inventory. It's all about the resources we collect, and it's not really about sort of that universe of resources. Of course, we have very siloed data sometimes. We have lots of legacy data out there that can be a problem. And then, for all of us, for our museum, digital libraries, institutional repositories, our ILS, our systems are often barriers to being able to do this work collaboratively or even do this work in some cases. And, people are human and life is dynamic. And this is one of the things I think has been a real challenge for library data, especially, is that our data has been much more static. And, people are so fluid, and we're going to talk much more about sort of how people change. And I mean, it's even things like, outside interests that may differ dramatically from professional lives. You have a science professor who is she's a semi-pro ultra runner on the weekends, or or whatever it may be. You just have these things where it just seems so, like, are these two people really related? Like, how these people can be. People change names, they change family units, they sometimes change their gender preference. I mean, all those kinds of things that happen throughout people's lives, and how that impacts our ability to be able to manage that data about them. And I'm going to leave this with you, and I'd say take a few minutes to kind of read through this, but it's about a person who's kind of struggling to figure out where they are in the world because of how their identity has shifted over time. And I just think this is particularly interesting and a little bit funny, and it seemed very applicable to what we're talking about today. And on that note, I will leave you for this time. I'm going to actually leave you on this wonderful little cartoon, and have a good rest of your week, and continue with the discussion and work through your assignment. And we will continue to explore identity management. Next week, we'll be talking much more about sort of the shifting nature of data and how that impacts what we do. And then we're going to be really looking at records, and we're really going to be digging into code and records and things like that. And then finally, we're going to really spend some time looking at those resources. We'll be looking at resources along the way. We're going to be talking about all the topics kind of along the way, but I wanted to give 1 week kind of dedicated to each thing. So on that note, have a wonderful rest of your week, and I will see you